Hello, everyone, and welcome to our podcast, Language Matters Indigenous Voices series. Today, we are honored to have a guest, Aiyana Twigg, who is a youth activist and a graduate student at the University of Victoria, and is a proud, and correct me, uh, Ktunaxa
Ktunaxa.
Ktunaxa citizen and a member of the blood tribe Kainai. So Aiyana is very deeply involved in her language revitalization, both using technology and different available resources. So Aiyana, welcome. Thank you for joining us. So we want to discover more about you. So tell us about yourself and how it all started.
Gisukyoke Avineskel, Husokel Kokni Gusawsaka Nasanmiki, Hu Eni Tunachat, Wan Magantik, Hu Gaki Ik Ingumshas Nukliet, Shak Yakit Ak Nukliet, Oki Natanaku Aiyana, Noch Dut Sitapigana, and Tunacha, Gitochkanak Timatimokboa. So first off, I just introduced myself in my two Indigenous languages. I come from two different Indigenous communities in Canada. I am Ktunaxa on my mother's side and Blackfoot on my father's side. So when I was introducing myself, I said, hello, my name is Aiyana Twigg. I am so happy to be here today, a part of this podcast. I am Ktunaxa and Blackfoot, and I come from a very small community called Yakit Ak Nukliet, or known as Tobacco Plains, which is in the southeastern interior of British Columbia. So since I grew up within my mother's territory, the Ktunaxa Nation, I didn't grow up learning the Blackfoot language or culture or really knowing my family, but that is something I have recently been reconnecting with. I've been learning about my family history. I've been starting to learn the language a bit, which has been really inspiring for me. And I also, about 2 months ago, was gifted a Blackfoot name. It was a very beautiful ceremony, and it was very powerful for me to be a part of that ceremony and for my Blackfoot community to open their arms and welcome me back. And so I was gifted the name Sakhtataki, which means woman on the other side of the mountain. And the reason for this is because the Ktunaxa and Blackfoot, they share territory in Canada, and they've had a lot of rivalries, they've had a lot of allyships. So the reason they gave me this name is because I come from those two communities, which is right by the Rocky Mountains. So I grew up within the Ktunaxa Nation. I grew up there on a very small reserve, and I actually attended school, the grades kindergarten to grade 12 in the United States. So I would actually cross the border every single day to get to school. And the reason for this was because the reserve I grew up on was a very remote reserve. We didn't live near any town. So the nearest town was actually about an hour drive away. And so the closest town for us to go to school was actually across the border, which was only 20 minutes away. So we would cross the border every single day, and we were able to do this through something called Jay Treaty, which basically was signed in 1794 between Great Britain, America, and Canada, to allow Indigenous peoples territory who is divided by the border to freely cross the border. So I actually went to school there from grades kindergarten to grade 12. And so through that experience, I actually experienced a lot of racism and discrimination while going to school there, because it was in a very conservative town. There was a lot of white folks in that town. There was very little diversity. There was only about, I think, 6 students who were Indigenous. So that included myself, my siblings, and my cousins. So I did experience a lot of racism. And so much so that I actually didn't want to learn my language or my culture. I wanted to protect myself, and so protecting myself included hiding my identity. And so that actually built a lot of identity crisis, a lot of shame in myself, and that is actually where my story begins with language revitalization. And so before I kind of dive more into that conversation, I will mention that I am 24 years old. I am a youth advocate for my language. I have been learning my language for about 5.5 years now, since I was 18. I graduated from the University of British Columbia in 2022 with my Bachelor of Arts degree. I have a double major in First Nations, Endangered Languages, and Linguistic Anthropology, and I'm currently a master's student at the University of Victoria pursuing a Master's of Education in Language Revitalization. I also work within my community developing resources for our language. I also use social media to bring awareness to Indigenous languages that are endangered, to bring awareness to language revitalization, to try to inspire youth in my community, but also beyond to get involved, to inspire non-Indigenous people to get involved. And I also work with an organization called the Canadian Commission for UNESCO, where I have been working with them on the International Decade for Indigenous Languages and trying to mobilize the decade within Canada. So that's a little bit about me. I'm just going to turn it back over to you to see if you have any more follow-up questions.
So that's incredible. That's incredible. And congratulations on what you have accomplished, and wow to what you have overcome. So you did not grow up speaking your language.
No,
you grew up speaking English or French?
Yes, I grew up speaking just English. And the reason for this was because my grandparents, they went to residential schools. And I don't know if you know much about residential school. And so because
but our listeners may not. Sorry for interrupting. Our listeners may not. So if you can tell our listeners, what is a residential school?
Okay, so residential schools were first established in around the 1890s, and they were established by the Canadian and the American governments. They were also constructed in Australia as well, I believe. And residential schools were constructed by the governments, but also the churches, to essentially assimilate Indigenous culture, Indigenous language, Indigenous identity. Their entire goal was to assimilate the Indigenous people by basically trying to have them learn Christianity, learn English, so that they would just become regular citizens. And the reason for this was because they saw Indigenous people as inferior. They didn't want them to speak their languages or their cultures because they didn't want them to exist. So these schools, they would forcefully take Indigenous children from their homes, force them to attend these schools. So children from the ages of 4, sometimes even 2 years old, up until they were 16 years old, were forced to attend these schools. And at these schools, there was a great deal of abuse that was inflicted upon them. This included physical abuse, sexual abuse, and mental abuse. Indigenous children were not allowed to speak their languages, and if they did speak their languages, they were beaten. They were beaten to speak English. They were not allowed to practice their culture. A lot of times their names were changed, so they would not have their Indigenous names any longer. They were forced to have white European names. They were forced to practice Christianity or Catholicism, whatever the religion was. They were forced to learn those prayers. They were also forced to do manual labor. And the conditions were very poor. They were a lot of times starved. A lot of the Indigenous children, they would get diseases because of the conditions that they were in. They would get very sick. A lot of times the Indigenous children, they would actually kill themselves because of the conditions. They were not allowed to see their families. So it was a very dark time. It was very horrific actions towards Indigenous people, and these were constructed from around the 1890s, and the last one closed in 1996. So this happened for a very long time, and it was actually very recent that the most recent residential schools were closed. And it's a very horrific part of Indigenous history, and it's a huge reason why a lot of Indigenous people are struggling today because of the acts that were inflicted upon them. So as I mentioned, my grandmother attended residential school, And my father also actually attended residential school. So I am actually a first generation survivor of residential school because my father attended residential school, and I'm only 24 years old. So these schools were very recent, and they experienced a lot of traumatic things. And so because they experienced those traumatic things, they were taught not to speak their languages. They were taught not to practice their culture because they were beaten for it. Because of this, they did not pass on their languages or their cultures to their children because they did not want them to go through the same thing. So this is really where and why Indigenous languages, Indigenous cultures are endangered, and why they are not being passed on is because of this trauma, because of this colonization. And so this is why I did not learn my language, because my grandmother, she did not teach the language to my mother, to her family, because of that trauma that she experienced. Therefore, I did not learn. And also, when I went to school in the States, it also was not encouraged to learn my language because I was exposed to my language growing up. There was 2 elders in my community who spoke the language fluently, and I would hear it growing up. But when I started school, I had a lot of teachers tell me, why aren't you just learning English? What's the point for you to learn your language? I had a lot of people telling me this, such as teachers, students, and because of all of this internalized racism and discrimination I was experiencing, I thought it was best for myself to just learn English because what was the point in learning my language? I don't want to have to go through that. This is the best thing for me to do. And that's what a lot of Indigenous people think in today's society because they are not encouraged to learn their languages. And there's also that very horrific history that's embedded in it.
Wow. That just and having that as a first hand, retelling the story, that is something. Wow. So what drove? Why not take the easy path? And you have your native language beaten out of you in a way. So why not take the path? Why just not speak English? And like I talked to some of our viewers, why don't we all speak Chinese? There are more Chinese speakers or um, than other languages. So why not just take an easy path? What drove you back to wanting to why, right? What is your big why?
So the reason I reconnected with my identity, with my language, was because all throughout my life, like from kindergarten to high school, I hid my identity, and I thought by hiding my identity, this would make me happy, this would protect me. But the reality was, it was actually the opposite, because no matter how hard I tried to hide who I was, I would never be able to hide the fact that I was Indigenous. And I was never going to be accepted into this Western Eurocentric society. They would never accept me for who I was because I very much was Indigenous. And so all throughout those years through high school, I experienced a lot of identity crisis and also mental health struggles. I was experiencing a lot of mental health struggles because I didn't know who I was. I was very lost. I didn't fit in this society that I was growing up in, that I tried so hard to fit into. It wasn't going to work for me. And so I started to reconnect with my cultural practices in my community. And through that reconnection is actually what healed me. That is what healed my identity. That is where I started to understand more about myself. And that's where I felt safe, was with my people, within my community, learning our traditional practices and being on the land. So we have a lot of land-based practices. And so doing those practices is really where I started to fully understand that this is who I am. And there was one particular experience that happened. I was actually hiking with my mother in our territory. And I remember during the hike, I felt like this push, and it was my ancestors calling to me and telling me, this is where you belong. This is who you are. And so in that moment is when I realized that I could no longer hide and that I actually needed to reconnect with my identity. And so that's kind of where my reconnection journey started. And then I started learning the language and the culture again. And that's really what started to heal me. That's really where I started to feel safe. And I think my entire perspective completely changed when I started to learn the culture. And that's when I actually understood that learning our languages and our cultures as Indigenous people is actually where we are going to heal our identities. This is where we can actually heal our trauma. That's where I learned the power of our Indigenous identities. And being Indigenous, it doesn't just mean being Indigenous, it actually encompasses our language, our culture, our land. All of that is encompassed in our identity. So they're all intrinsically connected. You cannot have one without the other. So for instance, I could not confidently say I am Ktunaxa without being able to speak my language, because my language is an extension of that. And that is when I really learned the power of all of those things. And so that's when I did. And I also, not only did it help heal my identity, but it also helped me understand the state of our language. So that's when I learned that the Ktunaxa language is considered critically endangered, which means that it's on the brink of extinction or having no speakers left, because we actually only have 20 fluent speakers of our language left. And when I learned that, I was like, oh my God, like this is serious. Like we have to start doing work. We have to start revitalizing our language, because our language is going to go dormant. There's not going to be any speakers. All of the current speakers that are speaking our language are elders. They're over the age of 70. And so that's kind of when all of these realizations started happening. And I realized I have to start doing something. I am the next generation. I have to start doing something now to ensure that our language will be preserved in the future. And that's really where I decided to start learning my language, getting involved. So I joined a program at the University of British Columbia called the First Nations Endangered Languages Program. The acronym is FNEL, and it's actually the only program of its kind in the entire world. And it was created by Indigenous scholars at UBC and non-Indigenous scholars who all had an interest in language revitalization. And this program teaches practical language revitalization skills, such as how to document Indigenous languages, how to preserve them through community-based strategies and community-centered ways. So I switched from linguistics into that program because I felt like that program fit my needs and my values and what I was trying to do better. And that's when I got involved in that program. And I also started doing anthropological linguistics. And through my time at UBC is actually when I started to actively support language revitalization in my community. And I was able to do this through different projects that we were assigned to do. So some of the projects would just be random projects like how would you create a community-based language revitalization project, or just how would you use technology to support language revitalization? We would have different projects like this. And so I would think about my community specifically, and I would think, how can I actually use this project to actually support language revitalization? And that's when I started actually becoming involved. And so I would create curriculums like land-based learning curriculums to teach the language. I actually created games. I created a twine game. It was like an online interactive game for people to go through and learn the language and learn plants and berry names. I also created an animation in my language. It was very hard to create. It was very difficult, but it was also really fun. And it was really interesting to see how I could use existing tools. So I used the Adobe Character Animator software. So it was very interesting to see how I could utilize tools that already exist to actually support language revitalization and inspire youth in my community to start using tools that exist to create really interesting language revitalization resources. And so this animation is now used to teach kids in my community the language. And then I also created my Instagram page called @Ktunaxa Pride in 2020. And I created my Instagram page initially to teach people in my community our language, because I realized that although I didn't grow up explicitly learning the language or the culture, I still did grow up within my community. Therefore, I still learned our cultural practices. I learned about our culture because I was always around it. And I realized that there's a lot of people from my community who actually didn't grow up in community. So they didn't grow up learning these things. They grew up very disconnected. They didn't know their family. They didn't know the language or the culture or even our history. And a lot of those people would come up to me and they would say, they would ask me questions about certain practices or just things about who they are. And I realized very quickly that there's a lot of people affected by diaspora who don't know these things, who want to start learning. So I thought, how can I make this information easily accessible to people, free, and create that space for people to start learning? And I realized, obviously, that social media dominates our world. We all have Instagram, we all had Facebook. And so I thought maybe I could use a platform like that to start teaching people these things. It would engage youth in my community, but it would also create that easily accessible space for people to learn. And so that's when I created my Instagram page and I started sharing about the language. I started teaching people things that I knew in the language, things that I've been learning, like how to introduce yourself, how to have conversations with people in the language, different things like that. And that's really where my language revitalization journey started, in terms of interacting with youth, creating that online space for people. And what I learned through using social media is that it creates accessibility for people to learn, but it also creates a safe space for people to learn. So a lot of times when Indigenous people are reconnecting with their identities, with their languages and their cultures, it's very intimidating because there is a lot of that. There's a lot of that trauma. It's very scary. I know when I was doing it, it's very emotional. You carry a lot of baggage. It's intimidating because you don't know if you're doing it right. You don't want to offend anyone. It's very hard when you're reconnecting. And so what I learned is that by actually using social media, it creates a safe space for people to start somewhere and feel comfortable doing it because they can do it on their own time by themselves. And then over time, they build that confidence to actually start learning from people, to start asking more questions. So it sparks people's interest in a safe way for them. And I also learned that it increases the visibility of our languages. So when I initially created my Instagram page, I thought that only people from my community were going to follow me, that were going to be interacting with my content. But actually, a lot of people from around the world started interacting. Like I had people from Australia, from Mexico, from Brazil start messaging me, Indigenous people messaging me and saying, wow, like I'm learning about your language. This is so cool. We have a lot of similarities. We have these differences. So I was able to actually start interacting with people around the world and start connecting with them in ways through our language and through our cultures. Although they weren't the same, we still had that common similarity. And it also did inspire Indigenous people in my community, but also from other communities to start learning their languages. I had a lot of people message me and say, seeing your account has inspired me to do the same, to create my own account, or seeing your content has inspired me to go back to my community and start learning my language. And so those were ways that I learned that social media, the power that social media can actually do if you use it properly. And so those are some of the things that I have done for my community. I create weekly phrase videos for people to learn. I also work specifically with my nation. And what I'm currently doing is I'm translating audio tapes in our language from the 1970s. So they're all in Ktunaxa, and I'm translating them into English, which is very, very difficult. But it's something that will be very useful for learners in my community to hear these tapes, to learn what was being said, because of a lot of the language that is said in these audio tapes is not spoken today. So being able to have and reclaim those is very important for our language moving forward. And I'm also updating, we have an online database for our language through a platform called First Voices. And this is where we have our we have words, we have phrases, we have audio accompanied, we have stories on there. So our language is totally accessible online. It's free for people to start learning. So I'm currently going through and adding entries. I'm fixing a lot of the database. So that's some of the work that I've been doing right now. Not only am I working in my community, though, to work on language revitalization through all of these different resources, I also truly believe in advocating for language revitalization, and that's some of the work I've been doing recently this past year. In order for us to actually be able to do the language revitalization work we do in our communities, we need support from the government. We need support from organizations that actually have funding to support us. So advocation, policy development, and legislation are very critical in this work. And so I actually started getting involved in that work about a year ago. And as I mentioned, I'm working with an organization called the Canadian Commission for UNESCO. And so through my work with them, I advocate for language revitalization in those spaces, within government spaces, within policy development, because it's very critical that we start doing that work. And I also wanted to understand language revitalization around the world. I wanted to understand the similarities that we have, the differences that we have, where different countries are at in terms of language revitalization. And so another thing that I did with CC UNESCO was I created a documentation toolkit for Indigenous communities to actually document their own languages. This toolkit is not published yet. It's going to be published hopefully in September. I don't know the actual date it's going to be published, but I list ways that people who have no experience in documentation, no experience in technology or linguistics, how they can actually start documenting their own languages. So I list equipment that they need. I list elicitation techniques and strategies that people can use to start doing this work, how to save their recordings, and how to actually mobilize them in their communities. So this is a toolkit I created because I noticed that there are really no toolkits that exist for people to actually learn how to document their own languages. And it's important that we document our languages because, as I mentioned, a lot of our speakers are older and they are starting to pass away. So we have to document this information now. But these skills and tools are not easily accessible to Indigenous people. So this toolkit will offer that in a free and very accessible way. So those are just some of the things that I've done, I've worked on. Very passionate about the work that I do.
So we would greatly appreciate if you would share with us and we would share with our listeners the website, and we can put that into the feed, into the notes, the website where we can find more information, and so that people can follow and look for the toolkit when it comes out. And we'll be glad to also reshare. Let us know when the toolkit is published so we can reshare and spread the word, and hopefully others will reshare too. Incredible work, but I have another question. A lot of communities struggle with the fact they say young people don't want to get involved. So what is your message to the young people? Why get involved?
My message to young people is that it's very critical that we as young people get involved because we are the next generation. We are the next generation of leaders in our community, and we have to be the ones to carry this information, to carry our languages and our cultures forward. And I think that for a lot of young people, the reason that they don't want to get involved is because sometimes they don't know how, and sometimes they actually aren't supported enough when they're getting involved. So for instance, I have gone to a lot of language conferences. I've been in a lot of spaces where we talk about language, and majority of those spaces are dominated by older people, by people who have been involved in this work for years, like 50 years, 20 years. And one of the things that I see often is that people say the young people are our next generation. The young people, they have to learn our languages. You guys have to learn our languages. But by saying that, it's not offering any support or any information on how to actually do that. So for a lot of young people, when they're told you have to learn our languages, that's a huge burden on our shoulders. That is a very big responsibility. And a lot of times, a lot of people say is, how do I do that? Where do I start? What do I start doing to get involved? How do I actually do this? So what's actually happening is there's a lack of support that's happening. And so I think in order for young people to feel like they can actually accomplish this, they need to have support from the older generation. They need to build that relationship. And that's the biggest thing for a lot of young people. And that's what I always tell people is you have to get involved, but you also have to start being a leader yourself in the sense that you actually have to go and seek out this information. Like you can't rely on the older generation in telling you this. You have to go and build those relationships. Likewise, the older generation also has to build that relationship with them and start doing that intergenerational sharing.
What is unique about what you did is you bridged that gap with technology, because young generation is using all of the latest technology. Older generation does not know how to use technology. I don't know how many people in the older generation know how to use Instagram, for example. And so you created that unique bridge and a way forward. And thank you for sharing your journey. We look forward to sharing your website information, Instagram as well. And we look forward to talking with you again in the future, because we want to bring more information to the communities about the incredible work that you are doing. So thank you. And thank you for our listeners.
Thank you.